Okay, hello and welcome to this tutorial on VLAN trunking configuration and verification. So a switch port can either be an access port or a trunk, and that's the first decision you need to make when looking at a switch port. If you decide you want that switch port to function as a trunk, then you have one more decision to figure out, and that is that port going to be forced to behave like a trunk? Or will you let the port negotiate? Will you let the two switches negotiate on how that trunk is going to function? If that sounds a little bit strange, don't worry. We're going to go through all of this information in detail. So we're going to take a look at something called dynamic trunking protocol. And you might be able to guess that involves some of the negotiation between the two switches if we choose that route to configuring a trunk. After we do that, we're going to go ahead and take a look at all the configuration commands we need. We're going to jump on two switches and configure a trunk in a bunch of different ways. And then we'll go ahead and look at the verification commands, not only to confirm our configurations, but also to give us insight into how a switch port is actually functioning. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so what is this dynamic trunking protocol? Yet another protocol to learn. Well, don't worry. It's actually very simple. Dynamic trunking protocol, often referred to as DTP, is just a way for us to establish trunking. And let's break it down into two simple approaches. On the one hand, you can allow the switches to negotiate to set up trunking, or on the other hand, you can go ahead and force them to behave a certain way in order to achieve trunking. So think of it in terms of that. Very simple approach. Either let them negotiate or you dictate, you force how they're going to function. So with that said, let's take a look at the switch itself. Now, when you get a switch from Cisco or you wipe out the config and you reset it to its factory default, all of the switch port configurations are going to be the same. And they're going to look something like this. Switch port mode dynamic auto. Now, this is telling the switch port to function in a certain way. Specifically, it's putting it into the mode dynamic auto. And what this is saying is this switch port is willing to negotiate to become a trunk only if the other side initiates the negotiation by using DTP. Okay, so it's saying, yeah, you know what, I'm going to be a nice guy, I'm going to play along, I'm willing to become a trunk, but you have to take the first step. Now this is all happening by using the DTP protocol. And all that is little messages going over the link between the two switches. Okay, so this is our passive approach, and that is how every switch port is going to look on your trunk, on your switch rather, when you first get it. There's another mode we can put a switch port into, and that's the dynamic desirable mode. Now this is a little bit different than the dynamic auto mode. In fact, this is an aggressive negotiation mode. Here, with dynamic desirable, the switch port is going to actively attempt to become a trunk. So it's going to take that first step in order to make the trunk happen. Now this is a good thing because if you have two switches connected to each other and they're both in their default configurations of dynamic auto, well, a trunk will never form. And why is that? Well, if you think about it, if neither side is going to take that first step to negotiate to then set up a trunk, then it'll never happen. So having one side as dynamic desirable is necessary. Now we've also learned about in another tutorial about the different types of VLAN tagging. This is referred to as encapsulation. How are you going to encapsulate your frames over that trunk? And we know there are two options, 802.1q or ISL. That can be negotiated as well. Some Cisco switches are no longer supporting ISL, so you may not even have the choice to state which one you want to use. It may just default to 802.1q. However, on some platforms, if you don't want the switches to negotiate the VLAN tagging method, then you can actually insert a command to dictate which one should be used. So it can be negotiated or you can dictate it. So if one side is in dynamic auto mode, then the other side must be, like we said, either in dynamic desirable mode or in a new mode, yet another mode, and this is the mode trunk. It's kind of confusing because all of these methods are bringing us, hopefully, to become a trunk, but this particular mode is different than the other two. See, the other two have the word dynamic in it? Well, in the switch port mode, trunk mode, here, the switch port is forced to act and function like a trunk. It has no choice. It will always be a trunk. It can never be anything else. Okay, so we talked about forcing a switch port to function like a trunk. Well, this command would do that for us. Now, even though you may use this switch port mode trunk command to put an interface into permanent trunking mode, this switch port will still send out DTP messages to the other side. So it will still send out the little messages to talk to the other switch. And the reason is, if you have the other side in dynamic auto mode, remember, it's still waiting for the other side to take that first step. Well, switch port mode trunk needs that ability to go ahead and take that first step. So even though you're forcing it, it'll still try to negotiate in a way just really to kind of wake up the other side if it's in dynamic auto mode. Also, a fine point of clarification, if you have both switch ports configured in the trunk mode, you can turn off the DTP messages from being sent from either switch, and you can do it with the switch port no negotiate command. Now, the reason why you would do that is if both sides are hard configured, they're forced to function as a trunk, then no negotiation has to happen. So if you turn off those messages, you're saving some bandwidth and you're taking a little bit of processing load off of the switches because they no longer have to process those messages each time. Okay, so this is a small side note. Finally, there's something I'd refer to as the access port exception. And that just means that if you have a switch port and you set it to function as an access port, then no matter how the other side is configured, whether it's dynamic auto, dynamic desirable, or even mode trunk, those ports are going to function as access ports. So the access port will trump everything and make both sides function as an access port. Okay, so these are the different approaches to setting up trunking. And just remember, if you get confused, think, do I want negotiation to happen or do I want to force it? And then if you want to take it a step further, if I'm forcing it, do I want to turn off the DTP messages as well? Before we jump onto the lab, let's just take a minute to take into consideration how a switch port is configured versus how it operates. So when we talk about the administrative mode of a switch, all that means is how did you configure the switch port? And then if you talk about the operational mode, that means how is that switch port actually functioning? And the two will not always be the same, because remember, if you configured trunking to be negotiated and that negotiation does not result in a trunk, well then operationally how it's actually functioning in production may be as an access port. We're going to see a little bit more detail in some of the commands we issue on the switches, but for now let's just imagine this. If switch B and switch A are both configured as access ports, well, you're going to get an access port. If switch B is configured for an access port, no matter what configuration command you put on access A, you will not get a trunk. Doesn't matter if you go dynamic auto, desirable, or trunk. Likewise, if both of these are configured for dynamic auto, a trunk will not form because remember, no one takes that first step in order to create the trunk. The good news is as long as one side is either dynamic desirable or in trunk mode, then at least the negotiation can be started for a trunk to happen. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're troubleshooting or practicing for exams. So now let's go ahead and see what we're going to do in our lab. Okay, so this is our lab for this tutorial. On both of these switches, we have VLANs 1 through 10 configured. And they're going to be connected with one link only, and that is going to be our trunk port. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through everything we just talked about. We're going to go ahead and set these up in a negotiation mode, and we'll see what happens. We'll see how it works, how it doesn't, and then we'll go ahead and force them to become trunks as well. And all the while, we're going to take a look at some different commands to give us some insight into how they're actually functioning. Okay, so keep this diagram in mind as we go through the command line commands and verification steps. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump on a switch now. Okay, we'll start off on switch A. And first, let's just take a look at the VLANs we have on there. You can see 1 through 10 are configured and they're all active. We're going to be using interface 024 for our trunk. So I'm just confirming here that the interface is actually up and we have link. So it looks good. I'll also want to show you the configuration of FA024. And you can see it's in the default config of switch port mode dynamic auto. Now, a very useful command is to issue the show interface command, but at the end we're going to add the switch port parameter. And here you can see we get a whole bunch of different information that you might not be used to looking at. It's telling us first that this is in fact enabled as a switch port, and you can see here the administrative mode that we talked about earlier. This is how it's actually configured, and we just saw that, dynamic auto. It's also now telling us the operational mode, how it's actually functioning. And you can see here, it's not a trunk. In fact, it's an access port. So this is a very useful command. You can compare and contrast how you intended it to work and how it's actually working. Keep this command in mind for troubleshooting. It's very useful. Just below that, you can see that we are set up to negotiate our trunking and encapsulation, our VLAN tagging, in other words. And then further down from there, you can see the trunking native mode is set to the default of VLAN 1. We'll check out later on how we can go ahead and change the native VLAN mode. Okay, so there's some more information on there as well. In your lab, take a look at that, but those are the main highlights, the most useful bits of this particular command. Okay, so we don't have a trunk, but we want a trunk. So let's go ahead and change that. We'll jump into configuration mode for FA024, and let's change the mode to dynamic desirable, the active mode, if you will. Okay, and I'll show you the config here. Now it's changed to mode dynamic desirable, and if we look at the interface switch port command, now you can see we have a trunk. Operational mode is trunk, and the administrative mode is dynamic desirable. That's great. We're successful, and we now have a trunk between these two switches. You can see that administratively we wanted to negotiate the encapsulation, and now we have a line for the operational status of the trunking, the tagging, the VLAN tagging, the encapsulation. You can see it's ISL. A brief side note: if a Cisco switch supports ISL and 802.1q, they'll both default to ISL. Okay. Everything else that we looked at remains the same. We're still using native VLAN number 1. All right, so here we're letting negotiation actually take place. The next command I want to show you before we change some of these configurations is the show interfaces trunk command. Here it's showing us port FA024 because that's the only one we have configured. If we had more, it would tell you every switch port on the switch. If you have none, by the way, you'll just get no output. So the top line is a nice overview of that particular port. You can see it's in desirable mode, tells you the encapsulation, and if it is in fact trunking, and the native VLAN. So really key points of information in troubleshooting. There you have it all on the top line. Below that, it's telling you all the VLANs that are allowed on that trunk. And we'll look later how we can change that, but we know by default that's every VLAN is allowed on a trunk. So that's why we have such a large range. Just below that, it fine-tunes the information about the trunk. Now it's going to tell us not only the VLANs that are allowed, but the VLANs that are actually active on this particular port. And you can see here VLANs 1 through 10, because those are the only active VLANs on this switch. That last bit of information, we're going to hold off and talk about that in a different tutorial. But just so far, as an overview, this command and the switch port parameter command are extremely useful for troubleshooting and verification of how your switch is actually working. So keep these in mind, okay? Well, let's mess with this now. Let's jump back into configuration mode, and I'm going to change this to a switch port mode access. So we'll issue the interface's trunk command, and now we get nothing because our trunk has failed. Why is that? Well, we're set to function as an access port, and so even though the other side is willing to become a trunk, it's not going to happen. We actually are stuck in access mode. just like we talked about earlier. Access mode will trump everything else. Well, okay, but let's get back into trunking. So we'll go back into FA024, and this time we want to actually hard set it. We want to force this to become a trunk. Well, if I hit enter here, you're going to see an error message come back. And that's because we cannot let the encapsulation be negotiated. We have to actually tell it how, which encapsulation to use, which VLAN tagging, if we're going to force it to become a trunk. What that means is, before entering this command, the switchport mode trunk, you need to enter the switchport trunk encapsulation command, and I'll show you the parameters. We have .1q and ISL, or the negotiate. So let's go ahead and choose one, .1q. Now we can go back and enter switchport mode trunk. Okay, so if you ever come across this, don't get confused. Your switch is not functioning improperly. It's just it requires that encapsulation information first. Now let's see what the port looks like. And you can see it's changed a bit again. Administratively, it's a trunk now, and operationally, it's also a trunk. And it also makes the distinction, the configured administrative and the functioning operational statuses of the encapsulation. So you can see they're both at .1q. The native VLAN has not changed. We did not make any changes there. Okay, so let's go ahead now, and just to show you, if you wanted to, you can jump into FA024 and you could enter the switchport no negotiate command. And here you have it. Now this port would not be sourcing any of the DTP messages to the other side. Okay, so those are the methods used to go ahead and create trunks, either by negotiation or by forcing it. Now let's go ahead and actually mess with some of the VLANs on that trunk. If I issue the show interfaces trunk command, again you can see we are allowing VLANs 1 through 10 on there. And I'll just show you the running config. Well, let's jump into configuration mode, and we're going to remove VLAN 7. So we go into interface configuration mode, and the command to do that is the switchport trunk allowed VLAN, and then I'll show you the parameters. The two we're most interested in are the add and the remove. You can do some of the other commands as well, except you can play around. There are just different logical ways to specifying which VLANs you want to allow. Just keep in mind, if you do not include one of these parameters, whatever VLANs you list after this word VLAN here will be the only ones. So for instance, if you have 10 specific VLANs all listed out, and then you come in here and you just want to add a VLAN, but you forget the add word, or you're removing one, you forget the remove word, and you just type 7, well, now VLAN 7 will be the only one actually configured. So be careful with that. Here, we're just going to go ahead and remove 7, like that. Let's take a look now at that interface config. See how it's changed? Switchport trunk allowed VLAN 1 through 6, and then 7's gone, and now 8 through 494 is now there. So let's say, let's actually show you that error. Let's say I want to go ahead and I want to remove number 6, but I forget to put the remove parameter in there. So I think everything's okay. Next thing I know, people around me are saying, oh no, there's an outage on the network. Let's take a look at that running config now. You see? We actually told the interface to only allow number 6 on there. Okay, so you need to be careful. Always remember that these parameter commands are very important. We can just add one now. Let's add number 8 and take a look at that configuration. And now you can see we have 6 and 8 only. Okay, so we have ways to tailor exactly which VLANs are allowed on our trunk. If we go back now and look at the show interfaces trunk command, we have, instead of all the VLANs allowed, we just have number 6 and 8. And out of all the VLANs that are allowed, 6 and 8 are the only ones that are active. We can go ahead and shut down VLAN 8 if we wanted to, and then it would just be removed from the allowed and active. There would only be one VLAN that was not only allowed but active, and that would be number 6. The last thing I want to show you is how to change the native VLAN. So show interface, FAO24 switch port. You can see native VLAN is 1, which is the default. Let's change that. So we jump into the interface configuration mode, and the command is switch port trunk native VLAN, and here you can see you just need to enter VLAN number. So I'll change it from 1 to 2. And now let's take a look. And here you can see the native VLAN has changed to 2. Now keep in mind, both sides of this link, of this trunk, both switch A and switch B, have to use the same native VLAN. If you don't do that, in the logs you'll see something called the VLAN mismatch, native VLAN mismatch error message, and that'll indicate what's happening. That you have one side using, say, VLAN 1, but the other side is using VLAN 2. So remember, if you change one side, you have to change the other. Okay, so let's summarize what we covered, and if you made it this far, congratulations, because we covered a lot of material. So you are now a trunking expert. We started off by talking about the dynamic trunking protocol, and we reviewed all of the different modes that we can put a switch port into. And remember, either we're going to let negotiation happen or we're going to force it. Then we jumped on the switches and we went through a bunch of different configuration commands and also the verification commands. Scroll back in this video. I didn't want to clutter this page with all the different commands, but scroll back as needed to refresh if you've forgotten any. The verification commands are extremely important. That's why I listed these two again here at the end. So commit these to memory. You'll find them very useful, not only to verify, but also in troubleshooting scenarios. We briefly talked about changing the native VLAN if we want to, and also a big component of the show commands were the administrative and the operational modes of a switch port. In other words, how it's configured versus how it's actually operating. Okay, so that's it. That is VLAN trunking configuration and verification. Thanks for watching.